Guys, gals, and everybody else in between, thank you all very much for listening. A few notes on this one. For the first 10 minutes or so, the microphone I used was not plugged in, so it was getting microphone audio from the actual laptop with the background noise of the fan. It's relatively old. Tried to clean that up, so apologies for that one. As for the content, still good conversation as per usual with the people who've been blessed on this series. And it's going to be a two-parter, which is also the first for this series, because this first one was about an hour and a half. Then the second conversation we had, which was about 2 months after recording this one at the start of February of 2022, was about over 2 hours. So putting them together would have made about a 4-hour long thing. And I think 3 hours is probably the max that I'll be going with on the I Know Great People series. But maybe when I'm doing it in podcast form, just audio, I might just put all 4 hours out at once. Not quite sure, but getting into it.
Hello, this is Silas, and this is I Know Great People, and this is a series of conversations that I have with great people that I know about different things that they're doing. Now, with this one, we're kind of asking, how is it to actually know somebody, and what is it that is great about what people do? So there's like a wide range of things with that. And my intention with this series is to share information about what we think people do versus what they actually do. And my hope is to bridge the gap between perception and knowledge, as I believe the more we know about ourselves, the greater the things we can accomplish just as a human species, as these little creatures, earthlings living on this spaceship Earth. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to do in the series. And I want to thank all of y'all out there for taking the time to listen to this, and thank the people who are here for this conversation today. This is my friend Stephen, and the main person we're going to be talking about here is Edward. Can you tell us a bit about you, your name, and how we met, and what we're going to be talking about today?
Hey, my name's Edward Hoefer. We had a nice little laugh about that a few minutes ago because my full name is Edward Carl Hoefer IV. And so online, sometimes I just truncate it to Edward Carl because, like you said, how do you pronounce your last name? And, well, if I just Edward Carl, nobody ever asks me that question. But my real last name is Hoefer. It's a German last name. And in reality, it's not even Hoefer, it's Hoefer. But if you don't speak German, then you can't pronounce it. And I was fortunate enough to live in Germany for a few years, and I picked up the language enough to where I could pronounce my name, but it took me about a year to be able to say my own name properly. And it wasn't fun trying to learn that. So when it comes to other people, I try to take the kindness route, and just be like, all right, let's just pretend like that part doesn't exist. Edward Carl. But sometimes you have to use your legal name for, weird reasons.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, my name correctly pronounces Kirchner, but we Americanize it as Kirchner. I mean, people pronounce it both ways. Either one is basically right for me, but correctly pronounced it's Kirchner.
Yeah, us Germans, we're all just kind of nuts. And what are you going to do?
I used to joke around that the German language kind of explained why the Nazis existed, because people just walk around speaking that. It just seems like everybody's angry and attacking you at all times. Like I can see people being on edge at all times. But yeah. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about specifically. You're going to tell us a bit about how you met, but we're going to be talking about you as a writer. I have a lot of questions specifically about ghostwriting, which is kind of more interesting. But tell us a bit about how you met Stephen, and then how we met since then.
I don't remember exactly how Stephen and I met. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago now.
Yeah.
And it was through mutual friends and probably some kind of political discussion. And normally I don't like talking about politics, because people tend to be reductionistic. They'll do a straw man of their opponent, or they'll get hung up on some little thing. And so I typically don't like to talk about it. And I'm assuming Stephen sent me I probably sent Stephen a friend request is probably what happened. And it was because I saw that he had a sense of humor and that he was flexible. Whenever somebody gets attacked, I have this urge to defend them, no matter who they are. Sometimes that gets me in trouble. I think it's a good trait, though. I think that when someone's being attacked, they're still a human being, no matter how bad they are. If they're a criminal, okay, lock them up, put them behind a cage, but then they're still human and we can learn something from them. So if you're going to attack them, I'm going to feel this impulse to defend them. And when I would push back on Stephen, or when I do push back on Stephen, because we still have some pretty strong politically based discussions, and when I push back, even when I'm wrong, he doesn't get upset. He doesn't unfriend me or block me or anything. He just says, "Oh, that's interesting," and we keep talking about it because it's interesting. Even if what you're saying is wrong, it can still be interesting. You can still find some value in it. So when Stephen didn't get all offended that I didn't agree 100% with what he said, I sent him a friend request, and now we've been talking for about 6 years, and I've really learned a lot because I know Stephen. And part of that is because he doesn't get upset when I make some wild statement, and then we can actually explore it and talk about it, and I can take these crazy ideas I have in my head and I can unpack them, and Stephen will then look through and say, okay, that looks pretty interesting, but that looks questionable. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And he basically helps me think better. And I don't have enough people like that in my life. So that's how I remember meeting Stephen, but my memory is also notorious. Maybe Stephen, do you have any?
I was gonna say, I was gonna say, you actually remember better than me, because I just remember, mutual friends. There was some discussion. We talked a little bit back and forth, and I think you added me, and then we talked a little bit via comments back and forth, and it was more Messenger directly, and then we just started talking more and more. But I don't remember the exact time frame, and
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I actually also don't particularly remember when we first started talking, but I think it was primarily on some back and forth. Stephen would be posting things, and I mean, I'd chime in, and I'd see you chiming in, and then I think there's a different group that we're in on Facebook, and then post other things like, oh, okay, we're still in this group together, and we just found that we were talking about pretty good things, pretty substantial or useful conversations. And this is the thing with social networks. So people talk about it's antisocial, but no, it's about the person. Social network is simply a tool. It gives you access to things that you desire. If you desire an echo chamber, you'll reinforce that echo chamber on social media. If you desire to have challenges to your thoughts, you can find those people that challenge and want to talk about things. And that's why I don't really understand people who just seem to gravitate to things that pisses them off, or they dislike them. They're just there, like, man, this is horrible. Why you guys do better? Speak in a better way. And like, you can find other things where you can have a disagreement with somebody without having that angst, without having that anger. You can challenge yourself without punishing yourself, without torturing yourself. And at the same point, you can also put yourself in a comfortable situation without just spoiling yourself and just getting drunk off of your own fumes. And I think that's something that I appreciate the two of you. In having these conversations, picking three, because I'm also thinking of somebody else that will come onto this series, Derek, because since we've met each other in different ways, eventually now we have a couple of projects that we want to work on together, and part of it is due to your background as a writer. And I'm also wondering, do you think some of this aspect of you, when you see somebody out there writing and expressing themselves in a certain way, and then somebody else comes and criticizes them, you might feel an extra need to defend them because you as a writer have also experienced that, and you want to defend the ability to communicate in spoken word in some way. Do you think there might be any aspect of that that's involved in this?
Well, there's a lot of different things that are involved in could you ask that question again? I don't know that I completely understand what you're asking.
I'm thinking, since you've experienced making a living and being out there actively saying, okay, I'm a writer, I'm getting ideas from my head, I'm putting them out, and also seeing what other people write, getting the ideas into their head and putting them out, and understanding there's a lot of confusion there between what's in somebody's mind versus what they put out. So when you see somebody being attacked in a way that you consider to be relatively unfair for the things that they said due to some misunderstandings, your experience as a writer in that process of actually putting out ideas out there, especially in the written form, might give you a stronger feeling to feel like, okay, I should defend other people that are also willing to write their ideas out there and present them to the rest of the world.
Well, Where I think that's coming from, I don't like being attacked myself. And when I see somebody being attacked, I just have an impulse to jump in and express solidarity. With writers, quite often, I'm not like that as much because I feel like as a writer, I'm part of an in-group. And when I read other people's writings, quite often I tend to be a little more critical because what I see quite often is it's the writer who's going on the attack. It's very rare that somebody who attacks a written piece is articulate and clear and makes a strong statement. Quite often, when I read comments underneath an article, the comment itself doesn't make any sense. It has to be read in context of the article and in context of whatever argument is taking place in the comments, because the actual words that they say could be taken at least two very different ways. You could say, oh, this is actually a complimentary statement to the original article, but the tone is way off. So you have to read the tone to understand the words. And what that means to me is that the person doesn't actually know what they're thinking. They're mad or they're happy or whatever. They have an emotion, and then words just come out and you have to interpret the tone. The words don't actually have any meaning in most comments. So when a writer writes something and they've articulated themselves well, and a commenter makes an inarticulate noise, I can't jump in and defend the writer because it's an inarticulate noise. And the problem with this is there's this assumption that the writer has actually expressed a clear idea. And quite often I see that the writers themselves are behaving the same way as the commenters. And now I'm doing the exact opposite of what I say I like to do. I say I like to defend people who are being attacked. And now I'm being critical of the writing profession in general. And it's a paradox because what I'm really doing, what I really want to do is I want to learn more about myself and about you and about whoever's out there writing and whoever's expressing themselves. And when I see inarticulate noise, that actually irritates me because it doesn't help. I don't learn anything from it. And when a writer who has decided to do it professionally puts out a statement that is unclear and is just obscuring the learning process, that is really irritating to me. And I feel like in the past, I used to respond to things like that because I thought that the writer just was having a bad day or they weren't expressing themselves clearly or very well. And I felt like, hey, if I poke this person, then they'll perform better. They'll clear up the misconception. And what I've discovered to my dismay is quite often when somebody says something inarticulate and you poke them, the inarticulation increases. And if you're nice to them and say, I don't understand this, then they will either insult you, or if they're feeling charitable, then they unpack it further and you find out there's nothing in the box.
Yeah.
They said something inarticulate and then they used tone to deliver a message. And then you say to them, okay, I hear the tone. I want to know more about your message. And it turns out that the tone is the message and the words are just a carrier for a tone. And I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little too deep into
I was gonna say that's one of my recurring complaints about the comedians is that like they say things in this smug, like condescending way, and it's like I think the fan base hears that and thinks, wow, they sound so confident, they must know what they're talking about. But then if you push back on it, they don't know what to say because there's no substance there. It's just, oh well, clearly you should think this, but then it's like, well, why should I think that? And then it's, they don't know what to say.
Yeah, good comedians and good writers are like Jesus. See, the first miracle that Jesus did, it always confused me as a kid, especially as a religious, someone from a religious community. I'm not religious now, but I was born and raised Mormon, and Mormons don't drink any kind of alcohol, not even beer or wine. And Jesus was all about the wine. And his very first miracle was turning water into wine. And the guy in charge of the wedding came up and said, "You're a very interesting guy. Most people bring out the good wine first, and then once people are drunk, they give them the weak garbage. But you saved the best for last." And good writers and good comedians are like that. They tell you something good to warm you up, and then they unpack their great material. A lot of comedians, the ones who are just middle of the road, they put their good material in the front, and then once you're laughing, they just throw in throwaway jokes to keep the emotion going, to keep that tone going. But there's nothing in the box to unpack, so they get you laughing, they get you in a good mood, and then they just keep saying things that you're feeling charitable, you're already laughing, you want to keep laughing, so they tell a bad joke and you laugh anyway because it's the guy's funny. The guy told a good joke up front, he's funny, and then you just keep laughing. And then through the middle of their set, it's kind of weak. And then on the end, hopefully they close out on a strong note. And that's how your average comedian works. With the really good comedians like George Carlin and Bill Burr, Dave Chappelle. I mean, Dave Chappelle, I've said it many times and I'll say it again. Dave Chappelle is a modern Cicero. Mm-hmm. And I mean that in every sense of the word. When I read Cicero and then I watch Dave Chappelle, I get this feeling of deja vu. It's like, okay, 1,500 years apart, two totally different cultures, but they sound like the same guy. Totally different educational backgrounds, but you're like, wow, this guy really, these guys would be great together. If you got them up on a stage in front of each other and gave them something to fight about, they would just be so happy. And because they'd give each other material that they could really sink their teeth into. And with, for instance, Dave Chappelle, when you give him a job to do, he starts out with a strong joke that really gets you going, and then he tops himself again and again and again. And he builds to a crescendo. It's like going to a good comic or reading a good book or a good article is like going to a concert. You can't go to a concert and have the performer start out strong and then go flat and then end strong. You can't do that. Nobody will listen to music like that. But that's how a lot of writers and comedians behave. They start strong, then they go flat, and then they end strong because nobody pays attention to what's in the middle anyway. But if you go to a concert like that, everybody gets bored and wanders off. And a good set, like from Dave Chappelle, is like a symphony. It's organized, it has structure, it starts strong, it goes somewhere, it gives you something surprising and big, and then it closes everything down at the end in a way that makes you feel like you've learned something. And it's not just that you learn something, it's like you've grown inside. You feel like you accomplished something just by observing either Dave Chappelle do a set or some great musician perform original, authentic music. So I want to jump in and defend people, partly because I empathize and sometimes sympathize with their plight. It's like, I know what it's like to be attacked. I don't like that. But I'm also doing it because I want to get that feeling like this time was well spent. Like I did something worthwhile and now I'm a bigger person for it. And when I go outside, I'm going to look at the world differently. And when somebody says something that sounds interesting and I don't get that sense, okay, now I'm going to look at the world differently, I want to ask follow-up questions because I want to give them the benefit of a doubt and say, you can help me see the world differently. How can you do that? And in a lot of cases, when you ask them, okay, how can you help me see the world differently? they get defensive because they just have noise and an empty box. And I want there to be something in the box. With Dave Chappelle, there's always something in the box.
Mhm.
In fact,
What's in the box? What's in the box?
Exactly, exactly. And if you're watching Seven, the movie you're referencing, the thing in the box is horrible. And nobody, I don't remember, do they actually show what's in the box? Or
They don't show, but
yeah, they don't ever show, but you know
it is.
what's in the box, and it's horrible. And that's the thing about Dave Chappelle. He's not afraid to put horrible things in the box. He'll put good things in the box too. He knows how to compose the good symphony. He doesn't end making you feel like garbage. Sometimes you'll feel angry when he's done, but if you understand what he said, and sometimes you have to watch him a couple of times to really understand what he's saying, because he's so funny. And when you're laughing, your brain can just shut off. And then you're like, wait a second, I thought he had a point there, but I was laughing so hard I missed it. And then you got to go back and watch it again. And then you're like, oh, that's his point. Do I agree with that? Huh, that's interesting. And then you leave and you go out and you walk down the street and you see some people interacting and you see them differently because of the experience with Dave Chappelle or with the big concert or with that book you read or the article you read. And when a writer has developed the skill to create the emotion and the noise, if I don't see that there's something in the box, my instinct is that I missed it. And so I follow up and say, hey, what's actually in the box? And if the box is empty, then they get angry. That's the typical response. And in comment sections, it's almost all team signaling. They're almost always saying, I'm on this team and this is our agenda. And in some cases, it's not even this is our agenda. I'm on this team. So if you're on my team, I'm going to defend you. And if you're not on my team, I'm going to attack you. And if some person like me comes in and says, what's in the box? Then they get angry because they don't know what's in the box.
Yeah.
Or if they have some idea what's in the box, they know it's empty or they know it's not pretty, but it's my team and I have to defend my team.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I get in a lot of trouble like that. And so when I see somebody being attacked, I defend them out of hopes that they have something in their box that they can share. And even if it's ugly, I mean, I don't care. Will it help me see the world differently?
I just wanted to I just wanted to interject one thing to sort of embellish your analogy about crescendo versus decrescendo. You see the same thing with tasting menus in restaurants, like the idea of you start with an amuse-bouche that's strong to wake up the palate, and then you have milder stuff, and then occasionally you have intermezzos, which cleanse the palate, and then you start with the lighter dishes and go up to heavier. And they always emphasize to us it's important to have a strong dessert, and if you have coffee, have really good coffee at the end, because people walk away, that's what they remember last. So if you have good entrees and everything, but then you have throwaway you have like cheap throwaway coffee and like a really weak dessert, people will remember that and kind of leave with a bad taste in their mouths, no pun intended.
No, that's a good point. And that's why they say leaving with a bad taste in your mouth. Because that's what you remember.
Yeah.
And to your point, in a good meal with several courses, if you try to put something flat in the middle of that meal, you risk ruining their palate.
Yeah.
And if you ruin their palate during the middle of the meal, it doesn't matter how good, well, if it's coffee at the end, then that might actually make the coffee taste even better. But if it's a dessert at the end and you've ruined their palate, then the dessert's going to fall flat. And then they're going to need that coffee, and it better be good.
Yeah. But like I say, you still want to go lighter to heavier, because if you were to do like a rich beef dish and then like a white fish, it's going to taste like nothing. But each dish has to be done well, but you're still building up that intensity where it's like, okay, you appreciate the richer thing. Whereas if you have something strong and then go to something weaker, it's going to fall flat for you.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think art is a language of life, and with the culinary arts, with writing, with the comedy, with visuals, these are different things that communicate things in different ways. And I think that was a good example of what you're saying with Dave Chappelle. And I'm trying to think, like with Dave Chappelle, I think of his comedy act, and I think you could read his comedy as just as a script and still laugh at it.
Whereas there's a few other rather successful comedians who I think they rely in part, maybe you have to watch them, or they have a certain voice in a certain way that they say things, the lilt that they have or the tone that they have kind of adds to the joke. Whereas Dave Chappelle, I think you could just read his stuff out and it's still funny, or it's still getting that point that even his more recent comedy specials, it's not even really stand-up. It's a comedy special where he's sitting up there and talking about certain things in a certain way, presenting a narrative, a stream of thought, a stream of consciousness that people can kind of tap into. And yes, you laugh a bit, but yeah, you feel some pain here. It takes you on this journey, and I think there is something admirable about that. And I think there's also that extra aspect of many of these good comedians, also writers, they actually write their jokes. That's why there's a big issue within the comedy community of people stealing jokes, because people take time to develop these. They go out, and even Dave Chappelle, he does this thing where you come to his shows, he shuts everything down because he's working on material. He's still working in his craft, but his craft in that sense is something that is more interactive with the people out there. So that's something to consider with that. And what are your thoughts on just writing itself? Because writing itself is not necessarily that it's relatively new, especially to have this wide access of people being able to write. Because we've had books even themselves, we had most of history where it was just spoken word, people telling stories, passing them on oral tradition. And then it got to the point, okay, some people could write, there's some books some people would read. But to have a situation where the majority of the population is literate, that is something relatively new. And just being able to read is one thing. Now, being able to understand what you read, being able to write letters is another thing. Being able to write the right letters is a different thing. Like with me personally, I'm relearning how I'm training myself how to draw and write with my left hand. I really have struggles thinking about something in my mind, finding the right words and putting it down, whether it's drawing or writing with my right. Now, getting that extra point, like this hand has been with me my whole life, like this hand, but I've been using this hand to do something. Now, trying to train this hand to do those same things, there's a struggle in there. And I'm thinking, is there an extra level of challenge that you think exists out there where we assume just because somebody can write, they can write as well as Cicero, when it's not the case. It's the ability to do it does not necessarily equate to capability. Ability to communicate doesn't equate to capability to communicate. What do you think about that concept of writing itself being still relatively new of a way of communicating in the world?
That's a really good question, and it's deceptively complex. You're actually going to what I consider to be the core essence of what it means to be human. See, writing is very new, and you said that it's new that where the majority of the population is literate, and my instinct is to say, are they?
Yeah, I was just listening to some report of Baltimore. It's like what they did a test of 700 or so of the students, and they said less than 1% was actually being able to read at a 12th grade level. And 12th grade level in America is rather lower than what it was considered to be literate if you go back to when writing was initially open to the masses to be taught. Like it's already a sliding scale, and they already can't match that. So yeah, you're right. What is it?
Well, I'd like to use an anachronism. What people used to say is, I've learned my letters. And that's fair. That is a fair statement. Most people today in Western society, and more so all over the world, but especially in the West, most people have learned their letters. That doesn't mean they know how to write.
Yeah,
and with writing, there are several levels to writing, and I want to touch on several important points, but I don't want to get too deep into it because we don't have 6 months to really go into this, and I don't want to bore your audience.
Let me interject here. With Ed, he'll be back on. He mentioned something with his background in religion. Jacqueline in the previous one had talked about wanting to be interested in knowing about people who've been involved in missionaries. And Stephen had mentioned Edward was definitely somebody who will come out with that. But we're doing separate projects together, and Ed is going to be one of the people coming on with our discussion that we're doing on, I'm going to start doing with A Man with a Thousand Faces. We're going to go more into how we tell stories and things like that. And I think on that series, you'll be able to delve as deep as you want into all these other topics in the writing. But give us some at least enough of depth in this series to do it. We can even have this be a 4-hour series. I don't care. Just speak as you see fit.
Okay, well, the short version of it is that once you learn your letters, then you know what the letters mean and you can put them together and form words. What does the word mean to you? When I say car, I get an image in my head and I get a feeling usually, and sometimes I remember some sounds. It's like, okay, loud muffler, maybe there's a knock or a ping. It depends on how you were introduced to a car. But when I say car, we all think something different. And so just because I know my letters doesn't mean I can write, because I can write out, I have a red car, and that gives me one particular image and feeling in my brain, and it gives you something different. The more I understand what it gives you, the better I can communicate with you, because writing is supposed to be a form of communication. Writing originally developed for inventory control. We have 6 clay pots of beer in storage right here. I'm selling you 6 clay pots of beer in exchange for 3 bushels of barley, so I can make more beer, or whatever. It was about inventory, and those are things where there's not much room for interpretation. You can say, well, my clay pots were bigger than yours. When I sold you beer last week, I sold you more beer because my 6 pots had more volume than your 6 pots. But there's only so much you can argue about that. When I say I like beer, that's much more complicated than saying I have beer. And so that's the first level is you know your letters. The next level is concrete facts. There is a cat. There is a car. There is a clay pot full of beer. Then the next level down from that is how you feel about it emotionally. And then when you go down another layer, how do you think about it? And I can construct a sentence very carefully and tell you that I like this car for these reasons, and it gives me these feelings, and it gives me these thoughts, and it gives me this power and ability. And then when I turn that over to you, if you know your letters, but you're not a good writer, you're not a good reader, you can read that sentence and misinterpret it. Because when you start reading, you'll see the word car. And if you don't have a disciplined mind, then all of the feelings and thoughts that you have about cars will want to unpack themselves in whatever I've written. And I could be saying, I think cars are bad for the environment, and they're loud and they're noisy and they're dangerous. They kill people. We should go back to horses, or better yet, we should just walk everywhere. And if you love street racing and you read that sentence really fast, you'll just say, oh, that's just because you aren't very good with cars. You won't hear the message about environmentalism or about human connection or any of these other things. You're going to unpack your wisdom about cars. I'm a street racer. I win every race I'm in, and I've beaten some people so badly they walked away and they never raced again. So you must be one of those losers. And so it's a cooperation. When you write, it's not a solo activity. It's a cooperation with your reader. And you can only write to an audience, even if the audience is yourself. If you're journaling, in fact, I think one of the most important things you can do is unpack your thoughts about what happened today. And if you do that, you're going to become much more articulate. You're going to be much more capable of communicating to other people. And so in that sense, the job of a writer is never done, because you actually have to teach your reader how to read. and how many people out there can really read? There are a lot of people who know their letters, and that's an important start. And at that point, then you become a chef, you become a musician, you become a magician. Because let's say Stephen stopped learning how to read and write in the 3rd grade because it was too boring. Now, I can say that because I know it's not true.
Yeah.
But if you are operating on a 3rd grade reading level and I want to communicate to you, then I have to entice you with what I write. All right. Okay. So Stephen, he stopped reading when he was 8. He stopped learning how to read and write when he was 8, but he's going to read my thing. So when I'm writing to Stephen, well, let's see. I know Stephen loves food. He's always sharing pictures of amazing food, and he can appreciate it on a level that I can't access. So he really likes food. So I'm going to be very careful and only talk about food in ways that I am certain I'm right. And I'm going to write something about food and how it makes me feel. And I'm going to try and entice Stephen to give reading another try, because he stopped reading when he was 8 years old. He's on a 3rd grade reading level, but he loves food. So I'm going to describe food and how it makes me feel. And I'm going to give that to him and show him how he can explore food in a purely symbolic and abstract realm, where he's getting a picture of how I interact with food. And if I do it right, then he's going to want to come and talk to me more about food and say, well, you said this about food, and I find that interesting because I see this as being more interesting than what you said. Why did you miss this part over here about the foie gras on the burger? I mean, I get that you like bacon cheeseburgers, but have you tried foie gras? And when you communicate with somebody in that way, you can open their mind a little bit more. And as a writer, your job isn't to articulate yourself clearly. Your job is to communicate. And if you communicate effectively, then you're a good writer. Now, there are certain rules. For instance, the letters need to be formed in a way that the reader can understand. If you're writing in Chinese characters and somebody has never been exposed to Chinese characters, there's no hope ever.
Yeah.
But if you're so there are certain rules that you need to follow. But once you understand those rules, the better you get at writing, the better you get at climbing into the head of your audience. And when you understand how your audience operates, you can then break the rules. Because it's like, okay, I wrote this sentence about how we need to get rid of cars, and I know that Joe is a drag racer and a street racer, and I suspect when I write this, he's going to think this, this, and this about it. So I'm going to start with those assumptions, and I'm going to say something differently so that I can build off of his unseen knowledge, his unseen assumptions. Because I know my readership, I'm writing this not for Joe, but for a broader street racing community. And so based off of the assumptions about the street racing community, I'm going to say some things that are going to trigger them in a positive or a negative way. And then Stephen, who I want to say you see a car as a form of transportation and not much else.
Yeah, basically. I mean, I've said like when I have more money, maybe I'll get more into cars and learn about them. But for me now, it's like, what's the point? I don't need one, and it's like I can't afford a really nice one. So,
See, this is one of the things that I like about Stephen. I can use him as a punching bag, and he doesn't get offended. So, if I'm writing an article for the hot rod community, I can go off of the assumptions that I've learned about that community and entice them and create images that will pop into their heads without them being directly connected to the words on the page. And I can write that kind of an article and I can show it to Stephen and it'll say, yeah, it's well written. The sentences make sense. It's articulate, blah, blah, blah. And you said this and this and this about cars. But to the hot rod community, I just provoked a powerful emotional response and made them think about facts that were not written on the page. And those facts don't even occur to Stephen because he's not in their community. Like if I talk about foie gras on burgers, for instance, I targeted an audience. And that created an association to prior conversations we've had, prior things that Stephen has written about burgers that are inaccessible to most people. So my comment about foie gras elicited a memory. And for most people, that memory is inaccessible. Now, here's the magic of it. If we're talking to people who also love food and have had foie gras and have had burgers, I mention that it's going to provoke an entirely different set of memories in them that will not be the same as what I just provoked with you, but it will be parallel or at least adjacent. And so if I write out that as an article and this anonymous person bumps into you and says, hey, did you read that article about foie gras burgers? Then you're going to be able to have a very interesting conversation that wouldn't have been possible without my article and without your background, your mutual backgrounds with burgers and foie gras and fine food to begin with. And so, yeah, writing is magic. And I believe that originally, when they talked about casting spells, they were literally talking about what I did with the foie gras.
Yeah.
And what Dave Chappelle does when he gets up and he talks about things, and Cicero and all of these other orators, what they're literally doing is they're casting spells on you. They are creating things in your mind that aren't in the words.
Well, I was just going to add, like, sorry, I was just going to say one thing. Like, it's sort of like you say, appealing to your target audience. Like, if you wrote something in depth about cars, someone like Matt Murphy would love it because he's worked on cars since he was a teenager. But to me, it's like basically what you said. But then with something like food, it would be the opposite. Like, I would think this is great, but he would say, what's all this fancy stuff? I have no idea. So it's like appealing to those different audiences.
Yeah. So one thing that you pointed out, the words of spells, I think a good point is that that's something that I think we started communicating or started recognizing with certain people or in some political spheres where they're using certain words as spells. Those words aren't necessarily something that, if you ask them to define what they mean, they're almost offended to you because there's nothing in that box. That box, they know it's empty. The box was never intended to have anything. You're never supposed to look into the box. It just wasn't something you were supposed to do. You're supposed to take that box for granted and assume all these other things. So I think that is definitely something that you see happening. But on the inverse side, I think there's some people who are trying to do some positive things or trying to give people the benefit of the doubt, and they're not really understanding that there's a difference there between what is being communicated and what they're actually seeing being done. You say, why is this company making this decision to switch this character around? Why are they following this storyline and ruining this whole background of this? It's because they're not really communicating to you. There's someone else who is their main source of getting that information to. And I've had a bit of that experience with the YouTube channel I started some time back. Before, it was more like a journal. It was more for me to just get ideas out. That I think one of the best visualizations of that was when Dumbledore had that little bowl of his where he would take out ideas from his mind and put it in there. And it would help me just get those ideas out and be like, okay, then I can rewatch what I said, or I can go back and I don't have to think about that. And also then after some time, I started saying, okay, now I'm trying to communicate something more. And then looking at the difference between something's in my head, I'm just saying it out to myself. If I write something down, it's different. Now, if I'm thinking, okay, this is something I'm writing down with the intention to record and speak to other people who know nothing else about me, I have to take that into account and now think, okay, now there's an aspect of how would I listen to this had I never heard any of these things before? And that's something I try to remind myself when I'm critiquing movies or games or things like that. I'm like, look, I've spent a lot of time listening to tons of audiobooks, reading tons of books, playing a lot of video games, watching a lot of movies. So if I see something like, I know this storyline, I know these character types. Oh, there's like 2 more advertising breaks. So this is not the person who did it. They have to catch somebody else. But then I try to approach things and imagine, like, if I've never seen a genre of this, if I've never seen a horror movie, does this movie make sense? Is this a good movie? And then it's like, oh yeah, I can see if somebody had never seen this. But since I've seen 100 horror movies, I can say this is one of the worst horror movies I've watched because I've seen 100 more examples of it being done better. But if I've never seen it, I can still appreciate it. Okay, this is still a competent way to tell this story, even though there's better ways to do it. So I think when I'm approaching the people who are trying to express themselves, especially through writing, I think that's something to keep in mind. And is that something you've experienced where
I don't know how long when you started writing, but how has that changed? How has your appreciation of the craft changed as you've done it for time? You can also tell us when you started doing it. Maybe, I mean, and we all started writing as kids and things like that. Started learning our letters, but how long have you been doing it actually, like as a profession, maybe as something where it's like, okay, I'm putting an intention to write to communicate, and not just writing to journal and things like that.
Well, in third grade, I was tasked with writing a story. Actually, yes, it was third grade. I was tasked with writing a story, and I created a complete story and even ended it with a cliffhanger. I just knew that cliffhangers were a good thing. I didn't know the word. I just knew that, hey, what if I put this guy in a situation where he might be dead and he might be alive, and just leave it right there? That would be so cool. That's what the thought process in my head was. And I only learned later that that's a great way to keep your audience hooked and wanting more. Now, I knew from watching cartoons and movies that I liked shows that did that. So it's not like it was an original thought. It was just I had consumed media and I knew what I liked. And so I wanted to recreate what I liked. And I really liked those books that when you're done with them, they leave you wanting more.
Mm.
And you want more when there's a sense of mystery.
Yep.
Now, to go back to some of what you were saying earlier, I want to talk about shibboleths. And a shibboleth is something we all use every day, and we often don't articulate what we're doing. And what a shibboleth is it's a password. The original term came from the Bible when in ancient Israel, some of the tribes were fighting, and they all looked the same because racially and ethnically they were all intermixed, but they were geographically separated. So they had slightly different dialects. And so one side set up a checkpoint at a river, a ford in a river, and everybody who came by, they said, say the word shibboleth. And based off of how they pronounced it, they knew whether this guy was on our team or on the other team. And then if you said it wrong, they killed you. And so a shibboleth is just a password into secret knowledge. Foie gras burger is a shibboleth for a very small audience.
Like people like foie gras, like Steven.
Well, it goes beyond us three. I mean, anybody who likes foie gras and burgers knows the password.
Yeah.
And the magic is, it's like in the Matrix. If you saw the second and third Matrix movies, you could use a different key on the same door, and when you opened the door, it went to a different location based off of the key that you used. And a shibboleth is that key. And if I use a particular shibboleth about food, then you two are going to go to similar places. They might not be the exact same place. They might be in adjacent rooms, might be down the hallway, but it's going to be close enough where you go, hey, Silas, I'm over here. What are you doing? What are you doing in the freezer? We're in the broiler. But if you talk to somebody who basically just wants beer and pizza every Friday night, then the key that they use, they might not be within hearing distance.
Yeah.
And that's the magic of a shibboleth. I mean, maybe we will go through the exact same door, and maybe we will be so separated that we won't be able to communicate. And as a writer, that's a problem if we can't communicate. My job as a writer is to explain to you the shibboleths in such a way that you don't feel like you're being preached to or lectured, so that when we get to the climax of the story and I take out that golden key and I put it in the door and I turn the key and open the door, we all go through to the same room. And with a good book or with a good movie, you explain all of the secret hidden knowledge as you lead up to the climax. And then when you go through that door in the end, all of this stuff that I didn't say floods into your mind.
Mm.
And if you write properly, that's what you do. And you can teach some elements of this. You can say, okay, let's see if I can come up with a good example. You can you can prime people. You can say, okay, cars are good, horses are bad, fine food is bad, cheap food is good. And then at the climax of and if you reinforce all of those points, at the climax, there is a car, a gourmet meal, and a horse. And based off of the priming, that's going to create an association that will automatically emerge in your mind based off of how I did all the priming. So if, for instance, Silas and I are making a video about nuclear power right now, and actually I do need to talk to you about that because I want to do another video. Like the call that I'm going to do when we're done here is going to be about using a nuclear power plant to make fertilizer in order to decouple with countries that are maybe a little unethical or overcharging for fertilizer. And if we can do a video showing how a nuclear power plant could make fertilizer very cheaply, and I've looked into it, we need to talk about it because really good stuff. So if when we're talking about nuclear power, we need to set the right frame and prime people to want nuclear power to be good, so that when we show them arguments that show that their fears are obsolete or unfounded, their fears have been conquered and cured, then they'll be more receptive to the idea. So you have to start out with saying, hey, look, there are people who need power, and it needs to be clean power. And there's this source of power that has been the cause of accidents, and in a somewhat tangentially related thing, cities have been evaporated by this power. It's a scary, dangerous power. And if we're wise, we can harness this power and turn it into a force for good. And we have discovered these ways to make it a force for good. And how you set it up is extremely important. You use those shibboleths, you use priming, you get these passwords, and if you do it right, then you hand your reader or your media consumer a golden key, and they open a door and they walk through to the place where you want them to be. And if you're and it's a scary power to have, because you can mislead people if you do it wrong. And if you have bad motives, you can abuse people with that power. And that happens all the time. I see it every day. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not always as charitable about writers as I am when I normally see somebody being attacked, because there are writers out there who may or may not have malicious intentions. They might just be part of a team, and the team is doing something that I think is bad, or they may actually want to do something bad. So it's really hard to know whether the person themselves believes what they're saying, or whether they're just participating in their team, or whether they're not even thinking at all, or they're just trying to be provocative, or this is just a joke. I mean, it's very hard to know where they're coming from. And in many cases, I think I put more thought into what the writer is saying than the writer put into when they wrote it.
I do find myself at that position, and I think it also is a bit of a challenge to try and figure out where the people are coming from. Is somebody just repeating something, or are they trying to actually communicate something that they don't have the capability to do? Because you don't go to a child and say, "Oh, baby, how come you're not explaining me exactly how you feel about this thing?" Because you understand that child has a limitation in what they're communicating. They don't have the words. They don't even know the letters. They don't know those letters to begin with to even understand putting in the words together. The emotions and the feelings are as raw. They want to communicate what they're feeling to you is as honest as anything can be, but we 100% realize we don't expect that from a child, from a baby. But we seem to just, I find myself just projecting like, oh, I'm going to assume that because you're my age or you've been to similar schools, you're going to have the same ability to do X, Y, Z that I can. Yet at the same point, I'll understand, due to my body type, my size, when I was at that same school, I was able to join the football team and play. But I didn't expect 95% of the people in that school to achieve anywhere close to what I did in football due to just certain things in my background. But when it comes to things like words, I think we take it for granted that, oh, that's just something anyone should be able to do. And that's not the case at all. Like, and I think you also mentioned that difference, I think, with the knowing of words, knowing the letters versus writing versus that whole one saying that if you just got an island with 1,000 monkeys, eventually they could write Hamlet. They technically it would come out from that situation, but it wouldn't be something that they wrote. It'd be something that they hit fingers on a typewriter, but it wouldn't be a cognizant thing of trying to communicate something, even though the same result is there. And I think with computers, that's the kind of things that people have fears of artificial intelligence. But I'm like, no, a computer, the internet, has access to all of the information that humans have, but it's not creative. Just because it has creative content on it does not make it creative. And then expanding on the last point, like there's a fifth thing I'll ask both of you, where I was kind of thinking with this the information age that we exist in now. I think part of what I'm doing with I Know Great People and many of the projects that we've talked about before and what we want to work on is to bridge that gap between the information age and the age of understanding. Because just having a deluge of information does not necessarily make it legible. It doesn't mean I'm going to understand it. Like you could give me access to every single Chinese person talking about things, but I wouldn't understand the thing that you're saying because I don't know the Chinese language. And I think we're at that point where there's a difference between hearing something and listening to something. And there's a difference between seeing something and reading something. And there's a difference between sharing something and describing it. And I was thinking that there's also feeling and exploring something. And I think that's most of the senses. I think the last one was probably smell. I don't know what the last one would be with the difference between just sensing something and then I don't know what the olfactory version of just experiencing the physical action of doing it versus some higher knowledge of acceptance with that thing. Maybe it goes with the whole thing where they say like smell is part of tied to memory, where if you smell something that might remind you of a certain location and there might be some excess spark there. So I don't know with that part, but what do you think of that concept, of that difference between just physical action of doing something versus participating in that thing?
Just to comment on the smell thing, if you remember, we talked to Laura about that with the wine thing. That's what she was saying about go around and smell different things, because then when you smell the wine, you'll establish in your memory what something smells like. Then when you smell the wine, you'll pick it up because you've sort of become primed to it. And Edward, we'll talk about this in depth later, obviously, but you were asking me about building a palette. And one of the things that I was taught originally was think in terms of very broad categories and narrow it down. So start like with fruit, and then it's, okay, what kind of fruit? Is it stone fruit, berries, citrus, what? Then from that, okay, it's stone fruit. Is it peaches, apricots, what? Then it go further. Is it fresh peaches, canned peaches, things like that? You just keep narrowing it down, but you keep adding in more categories, and then you can eventually get a very specific sense of what it is. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. Silas, can you repeat your question for me, please? I want to make sure that I get it right.
There's four different areas that I was thinking. If you can think there's any other senses to kind of compare the two things. So something that I thought of before was just a simple one where you can hear something, but you're not listening. Somebody can just say words, and I think there's a lot of that going on. We just watch something, and so we're just hearing what that person says. We're not listening to what that person says. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. And especially like we talked about, unfortunately, there's somebody who just lost their life, who just apparently committed suicide, but we have some suspicions about the things surrounding that. But this is something that happens a lot, and I know this is a triggering comment, an adult mentality required in these conversations that we have here, where people, especially now with all this social media, you have all these voices hearing what you're saying, watching what you're doing, but they're not actually, they see what you're doing, but they're not actually reading. They're not reading you. They're not understanding what you're doing. They're not listening to what you're saying. They just hear what you're saying. It's just the simple action is, if you're comatose, your brain isn't working, you're not conscious, but your faculties of hearing things, if you open your eye is still getting in the signals of the light, and it's still somehow going to your brain, but it's not being registered. It's not doing anything with it. And I think that's also part of why that NPC meme works, I think triggers so many people. Because a lot of people are experiencing people in their lives or going through certain spaces where they're not participants. They're just
experiencing, there's automatons and things like that. So what would be the aspect? There's hearing. Okay, the four things I thought of
think
was
I
hearing
have
versus
some.
listening.
I think I can answer your question pretty well now. There are commonly 5 senses that people talk about: sight, touch, taste, smell, and sound.
Mhm.
There are dozens of senses. There's another sense called proprioception, for instance, and that is the awareness of your
Sense of
body in
space.
space.
Yeah.
And as a football player, you're extremely aware of proprioception. If you're walking down the street and you just want to know where your thumb is, you know right where your thumb is.
Mhm.
Because if you're carrying a ball, you got to be careful with how you place your thumb, because you could end up getting it broken if you're not careful with your thumb placement, for instance. So there are dozens of senses. If you want to talk about senses as far as writing is concerned, there's only one that matters. Well, there's one that matters more than all of the others. I tend to lean towards hyperbole in order to make points. So, and that's a weakness, but it's also a strength. The sense that matters more than anything else is your sense of focus.
Mm.
The more you can be focused on an object, the easier it is to communicate about that object. And communicating is not me communicating to you. It's us communicating together. Even if you're not present, if I'm sitting down in my office here by myself and I'm writing, if I'm writing properly, then I have a construct of you in my head and I'm writing to that construct and it talks back. And the better I know you, the more information I can learn from my construct. It's really weird. It's a weird concept. If I'm talking to myself, I have one type of conversation. If I imagine I'm talking to you, then I have a different kind of conversation, and I can have epiphanies about how you might think about something. Now, those epiphanies may be more or less correct. The better I get to know you, the more likely I am to be correct about your ideas. And you can see this with people who've been married for a long time or who have spent an enormous amount of time together. When one of those people dies, the other person may continue to have conversations with them. And they may still find enormous value from those conversations. They may learn things that they didn't know by talking to this construct. And as a writer, your goal is to be able to build other people in your brain to the point to where you can actually learn from them. And the way you do that is you sit down and you write an article, and then you put it out there and you get comments on it. And the comments tell you what other people are thinking. Even if they don't articulate themselves well, you can learn a lot about them and about yourself. And then you can change how you write your next article. And over time, you build up these layers. Like when I was 8 and I wrote that story, I had a very simple understanding of cliffhangers and narrative structure. And every time I've written something, every time I've read something, I add a small layer of paint on top of my understanding. And hopefully, now that I'm 49 years old, that's a really, really thick understanding. Now, there are gaps there. There are holes, and I can't see them, because if I could see them, there wouldn't be a gap. But with any luck, I have developed a good ability to simulate how other people think and feel. And the better I can do that, the better I can communicate. And what that means is that when I'm sitting here by myself, I'm actually communicating with an audience and learning from them, which is weird. It sounds paradoxical because I'm by myself. But in reality, you can learn from other people even when they're not present. And the more practice you put into that, the better you get at it. And that's part of why writing is magical. There is a magical sense to it where you're creating something out of nothing and you're manipulating things just by the power of your mind. And the more time and practice you put into it, the better you get at it. And what you're really doing is you're exploring the human mind, and you're also stimulating human evolution. Because the part of the brain that does language is the newest part of the human brain to evolve.
Yeah.
The ability to think abstractly, to know about the future, and to communicate symbolically with syntax. Now, dolphins communicate symbolically. They have names for each other. And I believe as we get to know the animal kingdom more, we're going to see more and more sophistication in the animal kingdom than we've supposed.
Yeah, like we're saying, like with octopus or the cuttlefish, they thinking that changing color thing might actually be a language. It might be they might actually be communicating in a certain way where certain octopi will understand this octopus due to these kind of colored signals. It's not just simply like red danger. It's actually some concepts and things being because we know some animals can dream, and there's so many interesting things to kind of
You
think
bring
about.
up a very important point there. Symbolic communication isn't language. Language requires syntax. And the shortest definition of syntax is the order of the words provides meaning. Let's go meet at the restaurant at 5 p.m. That means that we are going to go to the restaurant at 5 p.m. and sit down. Or I could also say, at 5 p.m., something strange is going to happen at the restaurant. Let's not meet there. You can use the exact same words and have a completely different meaning. Like not is a contradiction word. If I use not in a sentence, where I place it is very important. Because without the not, it just means, all right, let's meet at the restaurant. Let's not meet at the restaurant. The order of the words contains meaning.
Yep.
And that's syntax. And maybe the cuttlefish, maybe the octopus actually has syntactical communication. I suspect they don't. I suspect they can share symbolic knowledge. And I know many animals can share symbolic knowledge.
Yeah.
A wolf howling is symbolic knowledge. When you add the syntax, where there's knowledge embedded in the structure of the different symbols, that is a level of sophistication that even if the animal kingdom has it in some place, in some cases, they don't have the same level of sophistication that humans have for it. And when we stimulate this area of the brain that is capable of symbolic thought and is capable of syntax, then we reward people for having a more developed sense of those things. And over the generations, well, some scientists want to say that humans haven't evolved significantly in 200,000 years. Others put different spans on it. But a lot of common wisdom says that evolution takes long time periods. There is a minority opinion that evolution can happen much faster. And when you look at dogs and cats and foxes and other domestic animals, you can see how in just a few generations you can make a fairly significant change. I suspect that when we began writing things down, the people who were literate went through significant changes that we may not have been able to identify yet. We will probably come to identify them. And as we project these letters and these abilities into the future, we're going to reward people who communicate with them better than we reward people who can't. And that's going to change human evolution. The brain is changing, and your children are changing based off of that as well. Not your children, but children in general are being given more privileges when they communicate better than when they don't. If you say, okay, I don't like what you said, so I'm going to pick up this rock and hit you in the head. In the past, that might have made it more likely for you to have children. But in the present, hitting people in the head with rocks is not an acceptable strategy for reproduction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the people who are able to articulate themselves better in more ways are going to have more children than those who just revert to animalistic instincts and pick up rocks and sticks and hit each other.
Yeah, it would be absurd to think that that evolution is not actually existing, because even just like look at something basic and physical wise, the average height of certain people, even like the Japanese people, just Japan was a very successful society, very successful culture before it really met with the West. But just changes in the diet after Western meeting changed the average height of the Japanese people to like 2 inches. It's bumped up over a couple of generations just because they had different kinds of diets. Then we've of course looked at certain people who are limited in certain areas and they're not exposed to certain things. Like you look at with beer and alcohol, how it affected the people in the Americas because their bodies hadn't selected for that. You look at an average fit person back in like the 1800s, a strong man. And you look at them like, oh, and then you just start looking at random people on Instagram, and like, it's like oh, half these fitness people would look like Greek gods compared to these people that they thought were Greek gods just a few hundred years ago. So to imagine that those physical changes are occurring, but we don't have similar changes in the brain, which is the most calorie intensive organism of the human creature. It's ridiculous to imagine that.
Yes.
And I think like a simple one I've thought of is glasses. Think about in the past, before the development of being able to actually work on glasses, how big of a handicap not having bad eyesight used to be. So these people who had a mental capacity or capacity to do all sorts of other things in the past just couldn't get enough resources to be desirable for a female to let them reproduce. As a female, they would be little worse at hunter and gathering, taking care of the children, so they might lose their desirability. But now
Eyesight
you have
wasn't as
glasses, and that
back
is,
then, though.
huh?
Eyesight wasn't as important back then. Right now, you have to be able to read tiny letters in order to be able to survive. In the past, you just needed to be able to hit the antelope with the spear, and maybe being
But we don't know
farsighted.
how big eyesight. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Well, eyesight has become more important, so we're more focused on it now. The human eye evolved to read human faces. The point of being able to see as a human, the most important thing is, what is Silas thinking right now? Is he happy with me? Is he angry with me? Is he going to give me a cookie, or is he going to punch me? I want to know those things. And one of the best ways to know that that's true is the fact that we have whites in our eyes.
Yeah.
The white in your eye makes it easy for me to know what you're looking at. Where is Silas paying attention? Where is Stephen paying attention? That's important. And it's so important that we selected for it. We selected for it over thousands, if not millions of years, and now we have a very prominent white in our eyes. And we have an idea of how long that process takes because dogs have a very small white in their eyes. And it's because they really want their humans to know what they're paying attention to. And so as dogs have been manipulated by us, we have given them whites in their eyes, not on purpose, but the dogs that we knew what they were up to survived better than the dogs that we didn't know what they were up to.
Yeah.
And it comes back to this sense. The question you asked me was, how do senses relate to writing? And the most important sense is your sense of focus. And the more you can focus on what other people are looking at, what other people are thinking, what you are thinking, because those thoughts are separate from your sense of self. The thing that says, I am me, doesn't think. The thoughts are happening in different parts of your brain. The part of your brain that says, I am me, pays attention to those parts of the brain, or it doesn't. And the more you meditate, like you've got mystics and yogis and religious people who spend a lot of time meditating, the more you meditate, the easier it is to separate that part of your brain that says, I am me, from the other parts of your brain. And there's a lot more of your brain that doesn't have a sense of self than that part that does. And I believe that that is where religion came from, because as people discovered, oh, I have this part of me that's me, but then there's this stuff out there that's not me, but it's in my head. Oh, it has a voice. oh, it's talking to me. Oh, if I do what it says, different things happen. There's this part of me that says, pick up that rock and hit that person with it. And then there's this part of me that says, maybe you shouldn't do that. Which part am I going to listen to? Well, the Greeks and the Romans and the Germans had Odin and Mars and Ares, and these were all gods that were very wrathful. So they indulged in hitting each other with rocks. And over the thousands of years, the people who indulged in hitting each other with rocks have not survived as well as the ones who said, well, maybe I should not do that.
Yeah.
And so these different voices in your head that are not you, but you're listening to them, to an early human mind, it seemed very magical and it seemed otherworldly because that voice was coming from inside your head, but it wasn't you. Oh, okay. What is it? We'll call it a god. Maybe I idolized my father and then he died. And once he died, I continued to talk to my dad in my head and he talked back. And then I had kids and I said, and my kid one day said, who are you talking to, Dad? Because my lips were moving while I was having this conversation with my dad. I said, I'm talking to my dad. But didn't your dad die? Yes, but he's still in my head. And then over the generations that evolved into, we have a God who looks over our tribe. And that tribe over there has a different God. Well, of course they have a different God. They have a different grandfather, great-grandfather who was idolized. And over time, these different gods developed commonalities. And so like Marduk was a Mesopotamian god, and he had over 500 names. I suspect what happened was you had more than 500 different gods who merged into one because of their commonalities and because some of them had skills that others didn't have. So, okay, this village over here has a god who is really good at being persuasive. This village over here has a god who's really good at warfare. This village over here has a god who's really good at farming. And they coalesce into a different pantheon. And then eventually you get it down to Allah and Jesus and Yahweh and these other super gods where all of these other ideas just kind of merged all together. Now, I could be wrong, but that's what I think about how religions formed. It's a great way to conceptualize these voices in your head and then share knowledge over time. Because if your dad was really valuable to you, when he dies, do you want to just chuck that value out or do you want to hold on to it? And if you feel like you're still having a conversation with him and he's still teaching you things, who's to say he's not real? And then in that sense, God is real as a metaphor or as a construct in your mind that teaches you things. And then now we're getting into some really deep metaphysical stuff that I think we should probably back away from.
Well, I was just gonna
get on to any other questions.
I was just gonna say this made me think of if you've seen Braveheart, Stephen, who claims to communicate with God. You know, what's that? Yes, Father. Is your father a ghost, or do you communicate with the Almighty?
Yeah.
And
there's a lot of good stuff.
An after image of somebody who's left.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of good things that you pointed out there. I've had some thoughts, even the way you were looking at the whole eyesight thing. That's something I've been focusing on. Maybe that's because we're very visual creatures, so we have slightly different points of view on that. But you added some aspects in there. But definitely with the whole coming out of the religion, how religion was developed, it's quite similar to how I was thinking about people experience things, and it makes sense that hey, we're human, we're Homo sapiens, we're animals, we're biological beings on this spaceship Earth, dealing with similar things. So it's going to make sense that we'll have similar sorts of definitions of things. When I was coming out to my religious childhood and things like that, I started to think, okay, maybe everyone's talking about the same God. They're just kind of using different definitions, different words for it. Just the same way people have different names for water. But water, we understand water is H2O because it's in many different places. But different places and different locations, you use different words to describe what water is. And then depending on how you lived with that water, it will also have different connotations to you in that way. And it makes sense that every sort of civilization, society that lived by water would have a water god of sorts. And then the ones who lived probably in the desert did not really have a water god that much because that's not what they're dealing with. There was no like people living in the plains with no mountains around who had mountain gods out of nowhere. It's like, no, you had gods that match the things that you experienced. And then there's some things that go kind of across the human experience. So you'll find a lot of crossover with those gods. And the Sumerian gods is definitely something that I want to focus on. I'm starting a separate series, just focusing on stories and things like that. Gone through some fairy tales with Snow White and the Little Mermaid so far. But the Sumerian gods are things I really want to go in because that stuff is super amazing. The Babylonian gods, that's everything stems from that in some kind of way. Majority of the stories stem from that, and I think we'll probably get into that in the Man with a Thousand Faces series. But you can comment a bit on what I said there, but I think we might as well head to the first question, and we can get into the actual rest of the questions here. It's been going great so far, as I mentioned. Yeah. We'll probably record this in several parts to see how far we can go now. So with this one, I personally, for my personal interest, I have a lot of interest in the ghostwriting, but you can, of course, talk about this in writing in general and whatever you want to talk about. So with this one, what are 2 to 3 things that someone might like about what you do? And I'm specifically asking about the ghostwriting, but you can tell us about the different other forms of writing that you do that you want to talk about.
Well, I've done a fair amount of ghostwriting, and the best feedback that I've gotten about it is that in many cases, the people I write for haven't actually come up with a clear concept of what it is that they want to say. Mm-hmm. And in our interactions, I've helped them discover what they actually think. So it's not like somebody wants to write a book and they go to a ghostwriter and they say, here's a big chunk of material, write a book about this. Now, I could do that, but it wouldn't be a very good book unless they have a very strong, articulate thing that they want to say. But if they have a strong, articulate thing that they want to say, then they'd write the book themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it wouldn't even occur to them to come to somebody else because they would just sit down and it would spontaneously flow. William Goldman wrote a lot of books. You would most likely recognize The Princess Bride. Mm-hmm. He also wrote All the President's Men, which was about the Nixon administration and the cover-ups. He wrote several others. He did Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Yep. He got an Academy Award for that. And he wrote very quickly. The first novel that he wrote it, I want to say, in a week. It might have been 3 weeks. The first novel that he wrote that got published. He tried to get published before, but when he sat down and wrote this novel, I think it was called Temple of Gold, the first publisher he took it to snapped it up and published it, and it was a success. Yeah. And because he had such a clear concept, it flowed out of him. So when somebody comes to me to ghostwrite something, I'm going to have a lot of questions. Now, not all ghostwriters do. Some ghostwriters are like, oh, you just want me to write this and keep it inside this narrow boundary. And they do a good job at that. It's a very good technical skill to have. I do not have that skill. When you give me something, say, okay, let's write a chapter on what it means to live in Boston. Here is some material. I'm going to write all that stuff out, but then I'm going to come back and say, hey, I need to talk to you because I've got a lot of questions.
Yeah.
What exactly do you mean about this? You didn't say anything about this. Is this important? And well, that's one of the things that's happened with my clients. They'll say, I want you to write this chapter or this book, and I want you to express these ideas. And then I come back and I say, well, what about this? How do you feel about this? And they'll say, I don't know. It's like, okay, do you want me to leave it out then since you don't know? And the response comes, no, that's really important. It needs to go in. But I don't know what to say. And so then they have to go away and think about it for a while and meditate and then come back to me and say, this is what I want to say about that. And then I say, yes, well, that makes chapter 2 redundant now. And they're like, oh, no. But it's a crisis in the short term, but in the long term, what it does is it helps them know what they think. It helps them know what they feel. It makes them grow as a person. And that can sometimes be painful. It can be difficult. It can cause arguments with the husband or wife. It can cause all sorts of changes in your personality. So writing is not a safe activity.
Mm-hmm.
And ghostwriting covers a full spectrum. I can give somebody a mountain of research material and say, write a book about this topic that expresses these themes and does this, this, and this. And on a superficial level, you can write something quickly that does that. The question is, do you want something that is actually going to captivate your audience? Do you want something that's going to reach people? Or do you just want to mechanically get the book out because you need a textbook for next semester, or because you already have an audience and they just want to hear more from you? If you're writing a textbook, or if you have an audience, or a very clear, simple point that you need to get across, how to bake a cake. All right. Well, is this cake for a 5-year-old? Is it for a birthday party? Okay, no problem. 2 cups of flour, 2 dozen eggs, whatever.
Yeah.
Is this cake for somebody who is retiring? Okay, that might be a more complicated project than for a 5-year-old who just wants the sugar.
A wedding. I just thought a wedding. Sorry to interrupt, but I just thought
Yeah.
a wedding cake. Like how much? I don't know if you. I was rewatching recently. I don't know if you saw Father of the Bride, but when they're looking at the catalog of cakes and wait, is that $1,200? It's like, well, at this price, it's very reasonable. A cake franc of flour and water. My first car didn't cost $1,200. Well, welcome to the '90s.
Okay, so you're talking about the remake of Father of the Bride.
Yeah, the remake, the '90s one with Steve Martin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen both of them and they're great. They're both really good in very different ways.
Yeah.
And well, that's the thing about a wedding cake. It's not meant to be eaten. It's just supposed to look pretty.
Yeah.
Now, it has to be edible too, because everyone's going to eat it. But how it tastes is vastly less important than the way it looks.
Mm.
And that makes a wedding cake a lot more complicated than a cake for a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
Even if you don't have 12 tiers and a little chocolate fountain and glass pillars and crystals.
Yeah.
So
I think had you finished your thought before I know Stephen injected.
Please move us forward so we don't get bogged down.
No, I don't mind getting bogged down. Like, seriously, I'm not kidding. I'm okay with having this be a 5 hour long
there's actually okay. Well, let's get bogged down for a second about getting bogged down. One problem that, as far as I can tell, is universal, is that we're all afraid. And the thing that we're most afraid of is inside our own heads. And when we want to have an important discussion, that fear can be so irresistible that we allow ourselves to get bogged down on tangents so that we don't have to face that unsettling thing that we say we want to understand better. Do you want to go slay that dragon? In theory. But in practice, I want to spend 20 years forging the sword. Now, I've got a good sword and I want to slay the dragon, but there's this part of me that knows that the dragon's got a really good chance of eating me.
Yeah.
So if I say, no, this sword isn't ready yet, then I get to postpone the day that I have to face the dragon. And so when we're having a conversation, quite often, there's a dragon we want to slay. And when we get to that dragon, I mean, I'm using dragon as a metaphor, but when we get to the point of this conversation, maybe it'll make you not like me. Maybe it'll make my audience hate me. Maybe it'll get me canceled. The Me Too crowd will come after me with pitchforks and torches. You know what? Yeah, I want to complete the conversation, but let's spend some more time over here so that we don't have to deal with the fact that you might think I'm a horrible person, or worse, you might think I'm the most interesting person in the world and you now want to marry me, or you want to move in with me, or you want to spend every waking moment with me. I think I'd rather be canceled in most cases.
Yeah.
than have somebody feel that way about me. It's like,
Yeah, that's
I need
100%
space.
agree with you on that point. For me, I would rather somebody look at something superficial about me and judge me negatively and like away with you, because that person removes themselves from my life. Versus the people who look at something superficial about me and be attracted to me, because that's somebody I'll have to constantly fend off who's in my life for reasons that are not really core to who I am. So that would 100% agree with that aspect. And that's why I think I value talking to y'all so much, is we can cut through some of the things. Some conversations we'll talk about more frivolous things, but sometimes I'm able to just jump into conversation, get to the main important point, we focus on that point, and they dip out. I don't have to be like, oh yeah, then how about we do this, and ask what the little niceties, because you already know I care enough that if you brought something up, I wouldn't just shut you down. But if we're talking about the main point, we're on the main point, and then we dip out. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, Edward, I think of something you said to me a while back too. You said you're one of the more rational people I know. He goes, you know how I know that? Because I can call you irrational and you just ask me about it rather than getting offended.
Yeah, yeah. So when you say what are some things that people about ghostwriting, what was the question on ghostwriting again?
It was like what are two to three things that people would enjoy about it, and I'd like to add another some more descriptors or modifiers to this, is the different forms of ghostwriting. Because I'm asking y'all who are listening right now, before I give my things, when you hear ghostwriter, what are the fields that you think of? Like, because I'm thinking the fields are probably mostly it's like autobiographical things that I normally think is a lot of ghostwriters. But then I also started realizing that I was listening to the No Agenda podcast, and they're pointing out that this one guy who writes a lot of books, releases a lot of books, but then there's this relationship between certain intelligence agencies that have certain people where they give certain information, where they pretty much bring an entire manuscript. We want to tell this message to the people. We have to disseminate this idea to the people, but we can't just be like, this is a CIA book. So we'll have a certain person tell a story that involves some of the things that we might have done, and we're just writing it in a different way. Then we put it out there. Now, if anything leaks, people will be like, you're just talking about James Bond. Yet James Bond might actually be actual things that they did, but they're putting it out in this kind of way. So what kinds of different fields, like from your experience in the industry, I knew it was autobiographical stuff. Like somebody writing an autobiography, they don't know how to put their life story in a cogent way to be an entertaining story. That's one of the most common ones. But what other sorts of ghostwriting are there? And do you think writing copy for websites and things like that is a form of pop, low-level ghostwriting as well? Because you're trying to get what somebody's trying to communicate and write for it. There's a lot of stuff in this.
Well, that's a very, very good question. And the answer reflects back on the thing we just talked about getting bogged down. Douglas Adams wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and he talked about this planet where everybody was psychic and they could hear each other's thoughts. And the only way they could not hear each other's thoughts was by talking. And that planet was wiped out because there was a particular virus that transmitted itself through telephone receivers. And because these people were telepathic, they all talked nonstop, so they didn't have to know what everyone else was thinking, because it was just too either boring or scary or disgusting or whatever. So everyone talked nonstop. So what most writing is, technically, is described by that story from Douglas Adams. Most writing is to keep people from needing to think. Most speaking is so that people don't have to think about what they're saying.
Yeah. You
The
and I talked
idea
about that.
is there's scary things inside of us we don't want to face. And we know we have to face them, but we're constantly fooling ourselves. And the further you go back in time, the more, actually, there's a great book that describes this, but it never gets to the point. It's called The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad.
Yeah.
And it's about colonialism in Africa in the 19th century. And there's this promising young man who was sent to Africa to go up the Congo and represent the company at the headwaters of the river, or as far up the river you could go in a steamboat and still travel. And something happened and the man ended up in trouble. There's bad communication. So they find another promising young man who is very similar to the first man. And they say, go rescue the first man. And when he gets there, he discovers something horrific. And that something horrific they never really articulate in the book. What I think they're articulating is that no matter how civilized we get, in our hearts, we are still wild animals that will kill each other and eat each other in order to survive. And the more civilized we get, the more powerful we become, and the more capable we are of even greater horrors and atrocities. When we're living in a Stone Age culture in little tribes, we're capable of some pretty horrific things to each other. But we could never evaporate a city at that level of understanding. So the more we pull away from that heart of darkness that exists in our distant Stone Age past, the more powerful we become. And if we're not careful, then those ancient roots can come back and destroy us and destroy our civilization. And so when we're talking and when we're writing and when we're reading, we may think we know what we're doing, but in reality, a lot of what we're doing is we're hiding from that heart of darkness that resides inside each of us. And we need people like Dave Chappelle and Rodney Dangerfield and Norm Macdonald so that we can face those things and laugh at them. Because when you're laughing at your heart of darkness, it doesn't terrify you so much that you're going to soil yourself. And then you can face those horrible things a little bit. And hopefully over time, you'll be able to face more and more of them. And I think as a society, that's what we're doing. We're learning how to face the horrors of what it means to be alive. I mean, one of the things in Joseph Campbell's writings, I don't know if it's in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, it's in his lectures, though, how as you become conscious as a human being, one of the first things you have to realize is that in order for you to live, something else has to die.
Yeah.
And that's horrific. Even if it's just an orange or an apple, those things are alive too.
Yeah.
And you can only survive as a human by killing. Whether it's a plant or an animal or another human being makes no difference. You're killing. And that's horrific. And most writing, most reading, most communication, most of what we're doing right now is an attempt to avoid the horrific foundations of existence. Now, some people may say I'm exaggerating there and it's a little hyperbolic. And they might be right. When I look at the news today, I don't think I'm wrong. The world is still pretty horrific. And I'm part of that world. And I share responsibility in everything that's happening today. I'm not Vladimir Putin, but how separate from him am I really? How much of Vladimir Putin is in my heart? How much of President Xi and President Biden is in my heart? Because we're all expressions of the same genetic code with very slight variations. And so without hyperbole, I believe that most of what we're doing at this very moment is an attempt to hide from the heart of darkness. And when people talk about different professions out there, there's ghostwriting, there's actual writing, there's farming, there's keeping the peace as an officer of the law, or so many other different things. And some people will say, well, the farmer is more important because he grows the food. Well, what about the comedian? Well, the comedian, they can die first. When the shit hits the fan, the comedian can be the first person into the mass grave. Well, but the comedian helps us face that heart of darkness. And how can you place a value on that? Well, okay, I'm going to value Dave Chappelle higher than Carrot Top. but that's how objective is that valuation? Maybe for
When the
somebody
carrot
else.
top was a farmer growing carrot tops, then you would go
Yeah.
higher.
Well, also maybe Dave Chappelle is for the sophisticated upper class that stick their pinky out when they eat, and Carrot Top is for the mouth breathers. Well, who's more likely to hit you over the head with a club? Somebody who holds their pinky out, or somebody who doesn't know how to breathe with their nose? So maybe Carrot Top is more important than Dave Chappelle, and I'm just fooling myself. And I think I'm so much better than everybody else because I like Dave Chappelle, and I find Carrot Top too tasteless. I could be absolutely wrong about that, but I think I am right when I say that most writing and most communication is an attempt to hide from knowledge and not to uncover knowledge. Because that heart of darkness that's inside all of us, it's really big and it's pervasive and it's powerful. When you look at the brain, there are different parts of the brain, and you have the amygdala down at the bottom, and the amygdala is where all the emotions sit. And up on the top, you have the cerebral cortex, where your thinking and your refinement and your speaking and your abstract thoughts reside. And this amygdala down here at the bottom, it has these powerful branches that come up. There are these huge roots that come up and influence the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex has these fine hairs that come down to influence the amygdala. And your heart of darkness resides in the amygdala. When you get that urge to hit somebody with a rock or say something mean or do something nasty, that's coming from the amygdala. And it's got these huge roots and branches that come up and affect the refined, civilized brain. And the refined, civilized brain has these fine hairs that come down and influence the bottom down there. You better believe I want to forget that thing down there. The more you pay attention to it, the more control it has over you. So it's very paradoxical. We need to figure out how to control this thing, but we don't want to pay too much attention to it, because the more you look into that abyss, the more that abyss stares back into you, and the more it turns you into a monster. So how do you deal with that paradox? I need to know myself so that I can be more civilized. But you stare into the abyss and you become a monster. It's like, whoa, okay, you know what? I'm done with all this thinking. Let's just go have a beer and eat some pizza.
Yeah.
I had a bit of a mental crisis, not a bit, it was a full-on mental crisis like 5 years back. And one of the things coming out of it was I just thought of this phrase, like I looked into the abyss and smiled because everything was as it should be, utter chaos. Because when you start understanding the things for what they are, I think it gives you an extra level of knowledge, of comfort, where you're like, okay, I can see this to be what it is. Now, with something when it comes to telling stories, because this is something I think with ghostwriting, I've always kind of looked down on people that use ghostwriters, but then ghostwriters need work too, because they're like, write your own story, tell your own story. But then now I'm starting to think that now I'm going into learning how stories are told, and then realizing that, okay, there's a lot of recent complaints of people changing stories around, recasting things. Right now with Peter Dinklage saying, oh, this backward story with dwarves, and like dwarves are different species. But then I actually read the history of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and it turns out that those dwarves were actually, might have been based off of people who back in the day, in the 1800s and things like that, they used to have children working in mines, and that stunted their growth. So they weren't, and even in that case, that's not necessarily somebody with androcorplasia like Peter Dinklage has. It's a kid who didn't have a condition, but due to the hard work, that stunted their growth. So that's a different thing. And that kind of changing of stories is one thing. But then we have things like with Heart of Darkness, and then most people probably know this story more popularly from Apocalypse Now, which was based off of that. But that's taking that story and updating it and bringing it in that environment with just excellent movie. And then that just one haunting line where he's just like, the horror. And I kind of think we are retelling stories. So there's not necessarily that negative a thing. I think it just, even in this length of this conversation, I think my mind has come around more on people who are using ghostwriters, because that's technically sort of ghostwriting what Conrad was trying to do. But then even with Conrad himself, it wasn't just the ideas that he had in his life. It was also the ghosts that were existing in his mind, people communicating things from other things that he was trying to communicate in this way. He wrote it as that way. Yes, you could probably film and shoot exactly what was written in Joseph in Heart of Darkness, but it wouldn't have communicated as much as putting it with Vietnam, updating it to something that's a lot more visceral to the people he's trying to communicate this story to. And now I'm starting to think also stuff like Dune. Look how Dune was made before, and then what Denis Villeneuve just did with Dune recently. So, how do you personally feel as somebody who writes for yourself, comparing that to the people who ghostwrite with you? I think there's also an extra challenge because it's hard enough trying to get your own ideas out, but then trying to understand what that person is trying to communicate and then communicate that stuff out.
Well, it depends. It depends very much on the motives of the people involved. I mean, it's a very important question, and it goes directly to the topic of our conversation. If if I want to write a book, but I don't have the time, then I can hire a ghostwriter. If I want to write a book, but I don't have any good ideas, then I can go to a ghostwriter too. And so the motives, where you're starting from, matters much more than the tools.